Hello, I'm Christopher Lee. Welcome to Ghosts. Welcome to Hobbs Manor, my friend. Please excuse me for calling you out at such a late hour. I trust you had a pleasant journey. Mark my words, you have an eventful time ahead of you. Allow me to introduce myself properly. My name is Dr. Marcus Grimalkin, and I have devoted my life to the study of the paranormal. It is time for me to decide once and for all whether ghosts are reality or fiction. I hope that you can help me to make this decision. My visit to Hobbs Manor, a house that is world famous for its ghostly activities, is the climax of my life's work. I came here to gather the evidence around me, the documents, films, and records that I have painstakingly collected over the years. Make use of the research material that you will find inside the house. You will have to look carefully for it, as objects in this house appear to gain a life of their own. Use my findings to make your own decisions. If you join me on my quest, you may be rewarded with great knowledge, but be warned, you may not like everything that you find.
Well, the first stage would be, I think, actually to talk with them. We need to ascertain whether some people are actually, this is putting it gently, some people are actually more prone to spiritual phenomena than others. Some people, for example, are constantly seeing visions. I've never actually seen a ghost myself, but I certainly wouldn't dismiss the idea of there being such things, obviously. So the first thing is really just to ascertain what is actually happening within the house, and then, or wherever it's taking place, and thereafter then just to offer them a kind of stepped service almost. We wouldn't call in the bouncers, as it were, straight away. Be something quite gentle. If that wasn't working, then we'd probably progress to the next stage. And then the third stage would be when we really felt there was just an overwhelming presence, and probably a presence of evil, that we'd actually have to call in specifically a man, a priest, who is actually designated by the bishop within the area, perhaps of the diocese, who could actually, and is authorized to tackle that. This is quite a different area to ghosts. We're talking about a rite of an exorcism, which is more to do with the presence of evil. And really the point of doing an exorcism is actually to make sure that that very presence of evil is actually driven out, whatever form it may actually appear in. So a little bit more radical than the way that we would actually treat with ghosts themselves. Perhaps I ought to point out as well that not everybody is actually permitted to do an exorcism. It's regarded as such a serious matter that a bishop in the diocese would actually appoint a man, normally a priest, to actually do the exorcism. It has to be, I actually talked with an exorcist a few years ago. It has to be somebody who is incredibly holy, because apparently part way during the actual rite, which again I haven't witnessed myself, the demon, as it comes out of whatever it's in, is liable to shout the sins out of the man who's performing the exorcism. So one has to be terribly careful that one doesn't sort of trip into this lightly, otherwise all one's faults and sins are going to be broadcast around the place. There are two basic formats for an exorcism. One is used quite frequently, where one is actually aware of something within all of us that's not quite right. Church calls that sin, if you like, but it's the same origin. We're talking about the very presence of something which isn't good. Again, if I could just illustrate that, I mean, this is quite a gentle little format, where we would pray over an individual or a group of individuals and say something like, Father of mercy, you led the man born blind to the kingdom of light through the gift of faith in your Son. Free these from false values that surround and blind them. Set them firmly in your truth, children of the light forever. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. That's more or less what I'd call an everyday situation, not that we use that every day. There is a second form, though, which is perhaps much, much more serious, and there we would eventually have to call in the designated man from the diocese, who would be appointed by the bishop to actually do an exorcism. Now, I've never actually witnessed one, but I've spoken to an exorcist, and it normally has to be accompanied, in the case of the exorcist, by a lot of prayer and fasting, actually prior to the little ritual. In the actual ritual itself, again, there is prayer. There's usually the laying on of hands to actually expel the presence of evil, devil, demon, whatever we would want to call it. And then very often, nearly always, a sprinkling with holy water. The tie there with the use of holy water is to baptism, when we were actually made children of God. So it would be, if you like, to install the presence of God within that individual and to cast out any possible manifestation of evil. The only other little detail I think that probably needs to be added is that it can be, again I've gleaned this secondhand from the exorcist himself, can be quite a violent thing if the manifestation, the presence of evil is so strong. He said that having done this, which was done in a kind of an old-fashioned vestry with wrought iron windows or what have you, round about the actual baptistry, he was actually hurled against the wrought iron. So there was quite a force, if you like, as the devil came out of the individual, and he was quite severely bruised afterwards. So again, it's not something to trip into lightly, and again, it's why somebody has to be designated by the bishop to do that. No. I think if we went to the simple definition of a disembodied presence of somebody who died, we'd actually say a ghost is no more or no less than just simply something which is non-physical, non-material, can't actually touch. Although, again, some people have actually spoken to me of almost like a spine-chilling experience of having felt somebody or something pass by them. The hairs on their arms sort of stand up on end. Somebody actually described it as she felt that somebody had gone physically right through her, and it was just chilling. So I wouldn't say that ghosts are manifestations of evil. If we went one stage, if we took that as the bottom plateau, as it were, went one stage above that, we'd actually talk about poltergeists. A little bit more physical there. There you've got sort of things coming off pictures and things flying around rooms and what have you. But again, the general definition is more of a mischievous spirit and not actually wishing evil to happen to the other individual. And the third, and probably the most extreme case, we'd say, diametrically opposed to ghosts, is where one would need to think about exorcism, a positive manifestation of something which was evil or which wished to cause harm to another individual.
This diver's helmet belonged to Mr. Montague. He caught the bug for underwater exploration. Unfortunately, a rather large octopus caught him. This Should you see a portrait fall from a wall, look carefully at the subject of the painting. This unfortunate person may soon be dead. Are you sure you want to leave the house now? As you walk around Hobbs Manor, you will almost certainly find some portraits and films of experts like myself in the field of the paranormal. Tony Cornell has over 30 years' experience in the field of paranormal study and investigation. He has developed a sophisticated ghost detecting machine called Spider, which travels with him to the hundreds of ghostly locations that he investigates. Dr. Susan Blackmore is a senior lecturer at the University of the West of England. She has a doctorate in parapsychology and has written widely on the subject. She was awarded the Distinguished Skeptics Award in California in 1991 and has been involved in the production of many television programs on the paranormal. Robin Furman is a trained psychologist and expert in the field of the paranormal. He founded Ghostbusters UK in 1984 and has since investigated hundreds of hauntings. Father John Nuttall is a Roman Catholic priest who preaches in the county of Surrey. He is fascinated by the subject of ghosts and has helped members of his parish in the past who have experienced hauntings.
It was on a Sunday morning, very warm, very hot, about 11 o'clock in the morning, and the group of people I was with went off for a walk, and I decided that I was going to play the trumpet. I was outside, I think I was playing Summertime or something like that, and quite suddenly I was terrified. I mean, I really was absolutely petrified. I was cold, I had shivers down my back, and I was so scared I ran into the house. And I didn't know why I was scared, I just was. What I realised was, when I stopped playing, there was no sound at all, nothing. No birds, no pigeons, the trees weren't moving, none of the trees. Now in a forest, the chance of trees not being moved by wind is almost nil, but nothing was moving, there was no sound at all. That night, I was in bed, I don't know what time it was, maybe 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, it was quite late. And I woke up, and again I was absolutely terrified, and I couldn't breathe this time. I mean, I really couldn't breathe. I was, and that was it. But there was definitely something was getting at me that day. The two incidents just couldn't, especially the still trees. I mean, that's the thing. Still trees and no birds singing in the forest. But it was, well, if that wasn't being haunted, I don't know what was. I mean, it's really, really quite a serious thing, which I'll never forget.
As I looked up, on the top right-hand side window there was what I thought was a face, somebody looking out, and those rooms aren't actually used anymore because, they're rotten, completely rotten. It looked like a child. It looked like just a little boy. It was.
When she was about 13, she came down to breakfast one morning and said that she had seen a Roman in a toga in her bedroom. And I thought, oh yes, that sounds a bit far-fetched, a teenage fantasy. But Debbie, later on that day, went out in the garden and was playing and came in with a small coin in her hand, which turned out to be a Roman coin with the head of Septimus Severus on it. So I was quite excited by this because it was quite unusual. And so soon after seeing this Roman in her room, about 3 months later, she had the same experience and saw the same gentleman in her bedroom, and she found the second coin on the site, and soon afterwards she saw him again and found the third coin on the site. Now all the coins had the same head, the head of Septimus Severus on them. Once was unusual, twice was coincidence, 3 times was a bit more than coincidence. And although I've never experienced or seen Septimus Severus there at all, we do have funny things happen in the house, like the curtains have been taken down, all sorts of odd things of that nature. And I believe that Debbie saw him because she happens to be susceptible to these things.
My name is Vicky Clark. I moved in October, and about 3 weeks after that the event started to happen. I did have two other roommates, but they've both moved out now. One left the course and the other one's found other accommodation. So it's just me on my own now. There was one night, it was quite scary. There was us three girls that stay here, living here, and one of my roommates woke up because she'd heard banging around her head, and she got quite frightened about it, and then she felt something brush over her face. So I got up and turned the light on, and we said, look, there's nothing here, it's all right, you know, we're just being silly, because we were getting worried about it at this point. And so we all sort of calmed down, and we turned the light back off, and then I got into bed, and when I got into bed there was a toilet roll in my bed. I don't know quite how it got in there, but and then when I woke up in the morning there was black, like tarry stuff in my bed as well. It was on my pyjamas, and it was on the cover, and it was on the sheet, and it wasn't there when I'd got up to turn the light on, because I mean I'd seen the bed and it was clean. So I don't know where that had come from either. And yeah, one day I went down to the toilet and I locked the door, and when I came back up it had moved a chair all the way across the room to right behind the door. I mean, we tried to work out if someone could have done it, but no one could get their arm round the door to pull the chair in enough. Also, we had some pennies on top of a desk one day, and it just sort of, it flicked one and it spun on the floor and then settled down. And also bottles fall off the side, but they don't tip over, they land upright. Also, I went home for a week because I wasn't very well, and the girls next door said they heard a lot of noises coming from the room, but no one was in here because I'm the only one with the key now. No one's ever seen anything. It just seems to move things. We don't quite know why.
I read one case, I think, that was interesting from the point of view that my fellow investigator and myself were somewhat scared. You get blasé about this, but we were in a house, an old house up in the Fens, north of Cambridge, and in a room that nobody would sleep in or live in, because they said funny things happened to them, and they were using it to store furniture. And when they put electricity in the house, they put everything else but in that one room, and we're in there. And sitting there, and we got all the other helpers, actual members of the University Society downstairs, doing a Ouija board, not to communicate, but to get everybody round so that we could control them. And suddenly there's bumps and thumps coming. We locked the door from that direction across the bare boards. And I'm saying to Alan, my friend, Alan, cut it out. He's saying, just cut it out yourself. I said, it's not me. And bang, 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 we got two torches. And we're showing, I mean, we've known each other for years. I knew he wasn't doing it, he knew it, but it got quite scary because it's a thump, 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 you see. And the last thump was on a brass bedstead over my head. And I thought, wow, I don't like this. And Alan said the same, more or less the same thing. That people were making a noise downstairs, and we used that as an excuse to go down and tell them to keep quiet. We got to the door, and we forgot that we had put strings across there in case somebody was going to take us for a ride. And we went through there and collided with that, came back, and as we came back we heard a noise, and we swung our torches round and we saw a chair going across the room and land bang on the wall. That was a bit scary.
One of the most interesting cases I investigated many years ago now was in an ordinary council house in North Bristol. I was called there because the family had been seeing strange lights in the sky, and the UFO group had started investigating it. But then odd things started to happen in their house. They were seeing strange things, they were hearing strange things, they saw the lights swinging when there was no one there, they heard somebody opening the front door but there wasn't anybody there. The clock was jumping along the mantelpiece of its own accord when nobody touched it, and the television was changing channels spontaneously with nobody near it. So they called me in to try and find out what was happening. I found a very pleasant and interesting family. I got on fine. I went there a day a week for many weeks and sat there and watched. And of course nothing happened. And I got them to keep a diary, and I put various pieces of apparatus in there to detect what was going on, and nothing was detected at all. I put a sort of fraud detecting piece of apparatus there, and they didn't fall for that and commit any frauds, which meant that I could relax a bit about that. And then one day when I was sitting there, the clock jumped along the mantelpiece. And I thought, wow, you know, at last something psychic's happened. Amazing. So I wanted to find out, was this to do with the position on the mantelpiece? Would any clock in that position jump? Or was it something about the clock? Was the clock haunted or the place haunted? So I thought the best thing to do was replace that clock with another clock and take the jumping clock away to my house. So I got them to put another clock on the mantelpiece, and I took the jumping clock home to my desk, put it down on my desk, kept working, day after day, and suddenly it went ch-ch, and I thought, whatever this is, whether it's a ghost or something normal, it's in the clock. So I took it to a technician I knew who specialises in mending clocks, and he took it to bits. And he told me that it was a very cheap metal 1950s clock with a very heavy, old, dirty spring in it that was totally clogged up, he showed me, with muck and dirt and so on. And what happened was, you wind the spring tight, it all sticks together with this gooey stuff, and then as it unwinds, it sticks, and then jumps. And because the clock's so light, and it was on a shiny tiled mantelpiece, it would actually move it a long way along. And that was the beginning of dismantling the story. It turned out that the television channels could be changed by various kinds of sounds, ultrasound, that could be produced by the rattling of a dog's chain, and often it happened when the dog was lying in front of the television, and other sounds as well could do it. We tried some out, and gradually the whole thing fell to pieces. Now I still don't know whether really the lights were swinging when nobody was there, as the people said. I never saw that happen, and I have only their word to go on. And that's how it's always been. Things I've been able to investigate have turned out to have a normal explanation, and a lot remains that I just don't know. I think that's a very difficult and interesting case. I knew some of the people who were there, and everybody I talked to who'd been there came back with a totally different account of what had happened. What seems most interesting to me about that case is the telephone bills and the idea that you couldn't dial fast enough to get the speaking clock. But I've never been able to find out, although I have tried, to get a transcript of the phone bill or anything that would show me that was really true. As far as I'm concerned, from the investigations I've done, that remains a fascinating bit of hearsay that I haven't been able to track down. That's always how it is, and it's very frustrating, because maybe it's true and I'm wrong, but I can never seem to get hold of a bit of evidence that's really convincing.
We had two automatic cameras set up in the room, which were controlled by a button from outside the room, so that if we heard anything happening in the bedroom that was untoward, we could start the cameras going. And the cameras used to flash at half-second intervals. And we got various episodes happening, but here's a particular interesting one. There's 3 episodes, 3 camera shots here at half-second intervals. The first camera shot shows a pillow here apparently going towards the camera, which is over here in front. And we know that that pillow and the one on the floor there were on the bed here by the side of Margaret. Now, so we've got a pillow actually going towards the camera now. The second photograph here shows the pillow has now doubled up here and is going in the other direction, like backwards. And the third photograph, at half-second interval, shows the pillow has now come forward again and is resting on top of the one that was on the floor. So in actual fact, we've got the pillow doing a zigzag motion. Well, physically, of course, that's not possible. For some time, the mother and the children have been telling us that the bedclothes have been flying up the wall and the curtains have been billowing out into the room. Well, we hadn't seen this at all, and we had just had to take it at face value what they told us. But one night we got a sequence of 4 pictures on our automatic cameras which shows that actually happening. Here on the first one you see the bedclothes, the bed cover flying up the wall here, the curtain billowing out into the room, and it was mid-December. The window was shut tight, no drafts, and yet the curtain is billowing out into the room. The next picture shows The curtain has now, the bedclothes have now dropped down, but the curtain is moving because in the first picture that was concave, that was convex and is now concave, so we know the curtain is moving. Janet here has not moved her hand very much, it's more or less still on her stomach and her thigh. Here, the next picture, the curtain has moved again because now it's more or less straight. And in the last picture, the fourth picture, the curtain here has twisted round and the bedclothes has twisted round as though to meet one another. Well, you heard the story of the levitations in the case. Here we believe we actually have a levitation of the girl flying through the air. And you have a look at Margaret over that side there. You see Margaret, very, very strange thing for girls to be doing at 3 o'clock in the morning. There's Janet flying through the air. And Margaret is there lying in bed with one foot up the wall and one hand up in the air. You must admit, a bit peculiar, even if she's just jumped. But let's look at the next picture. The next picture shows the similar thing happening, but this time the mother is in the room. Similar thing happening. See? I'll show you the first picture again, so you perhaps see them both side by side. Right? Now, when I questioned the mother on this, I said, what was happening at the time? She said, Janet was lying in bed and I was talking to Janet. I said, then what happened? She says, I don't know. She says, suddenly Janet was flying through the air. I said, now, let's get this straight. You were talking to Janet, and what did Janet do? Did she get out from under the covers, go to the top of the bed and jump? She said, no. I was talking to Janet, and suddenly Janet was flying through the air. I said, you sure? She said, absolutely positive. So how did Janet get into that position if she's lying down talking to her mother? This one is of a similar incident again. It wasn't done once, twice or 3 times, it kept on happening, and usually in the middle of the night. Janet from time to time had very, very bad trance, very violent trance situations, so bad at one time that we thought that she might even kill herself. She used to rush over and smash her head on the wall. It was a dreadful thing to see. She used to swear and curse, and she was so strong, in fact, that one time she picked up a social worker who was lying on the bed trying to restrain her and threw her straight off the bed. And this social worker, this woman, was an ex-policewoman, and she wasn't a very small woman, I can assure you. Incredible. Anyway, one night, when she was in a very, very bad state, we called a doctor who came, and he gave her a 10 milligram injection of Valium to quieten her down. Well, 10 milligram would knock an adult out, not a child. She went out like a light. And then we all went downstairs, and the rest of the children, the other children had gone to sleep. We went downstairs. 40 minutes later, there was an enormous explosion. I thought the top of the house had come up. We rushed up the stairs into the bedroom. No Janet. She disappeared in the bed. Well, we looked at the bed, what's happening? And then we looked round, and we saw Janet on top of this chest of drawers. There's a radio there and a chest of drawers. She's on top of the radio. She'd been thrown apparently 14 feet across the room, and she was either in deep sleep or unconscious, because I examined her eyes and everything. She was either in very deep sleep or unconscious. That happened 3 times that night. Here is Janet in this violent trance state where I'm restraining her. All pretty violent stuff. And here's another one, similar. Here's just a small one taken with my camera. I have plenty of these. This one's got iron thread, which was found on the back of the bathroom door. Whether Fred did it, or whether the children did it, it's anybody's guess. But anyway, that was found on the back of the door. And here's another rather amateurish photograph of some of the furniture turning over. the secretary of our society, Eleanor O'Keefe, rang me up and said, Morris, there's something going on in Enfield, sounds like a case, poltergeist case, do you want to investigate it? I said, fine, yes, I'll investigate it, thinking at that time that I would only be involved for about 3 weeks. Little did I know. So off I trotted to Enfield and met these people involved in the case. Now, what had happened was this, that the mother had complained that various things as PK, that's psychokinetic phenomena, had been going on in the house. One evening, for instance, the children started creating upstairs in the bedroom, and she went upstairs, and the children said to her, well, that chest of drawers over there is moving. And she said, don't be so ridiculous, go to sleep. And she was just about to go out of the room when she saw the wardrobe move. There were many witnesses to the case besides the family, because this is another question I'm often asked. There were outside witnesses in the street who were not involved in the case at all. There was the policeman who came, the 2 policemen who came and saw something happen, and saw a chair slide across the floor. There was a fire brigade, there was a priest, there was the family down the road, the Birkins, the uncle and the aunt and their children, the Nottinghams, the next door neighbours, a neighbour down the road who started complaining that things were happening in her house, the next door neighbours who complained. In fact, I could go on literally forever, the number of people who were involved as either direct witnesses or indirect witnesses, because one doesn't always have to see everything direct. One sometimes picks up the whole feeling by going into the house, and we had visitors galore, you can imagine, and people pick up the feeling of what's going on. That's another thing people don't understand about poltergeist cases. It's not just what's happening physically, it's what's happening psychologically as well. It's very important to the case, very important, because psychological factors affect what is going on. I suppose that one of the most extraordinary things about the whole case was the voice. Now, this voice was quite something. And how it started was this. On December the 10th, 1977 we're talking about, I was sitting in the room, in the front room there, downstairs, with the mother and the children, and we were just talking, and suddenly there was whistling and going on. And I thought, that's funny, it's very sophisticated whistling. The children can't whistle like that. It sounds like the whistling that Mr. Nottingham does. He whistles quite a bit next door, but he's not there, he's at work. I thought, crazy. Suddenly a dog barked in the room. Fine, a dog barked in the room, but there was no dog there. I thought, well, this is even crazier still. And I began to think, okay, it can whistle, it can bark, and things began to turn around in my head. And it went on quite a bit. Then, about lunchtime, Guy Playfair came along, and I said to Guy, this morning I heard a dog barking and whistling in the room, and there was no dog there. And I said, it was a dog barking. No, he took everything in his stride, he always did. And we decided then that if it could bark and it could whistle, it maybe I should talk. And I said to Guy, well, I'll tell you what, if it happens this evening, I'm going to take the children into the bedroom by themselves and see whether it can talk. Now, this was the day that 9 other investigators, most of them scientists, were in the house. So we had quite a lot of people who heard the first noise that was made. About 6 o'clock in the evening, when everybody was there, got the barking and whistling again. Round about 9 o'clock, if I remember rightly, I said to Mrs. Hodson, can I take the children upstairs? I want to do an experiment. She said, okay. I mean, she's used to it by now. She's used to everything. So I took the children upstairs and they got into bed. And in the next bedroom, in the small box room, Guy Playfair was there with his headphones on, and we put a microphone in the room I was in with the children, so he could hear all what was going on. And the barking and whistling was going on. Then I suddenly said, if you can bark and you can whistle, you can talk. Say my name. For quite a while nothing happened. And suddenly it said, Morris. I thought, good. Good, some results. And then I challenged it again. I said, no, that's not my name, because I didn't hear it properly, you see. It was like Morris, something like that. So I said, say it again. This time it said, Morris, quite clearly. Then I challenged it to say Dr. Belloff. Dr. Belloff, one of my colleagues, was there that night. He's a very famous parapsychologist. And it said Dr. Belloff. So I knew that we had a voice. Now, what was this voice? How did it work? First of all, when it started to speak, I thought we had a discarnate voice, what we call discarnate voice, a voice coming from nowhere out of the air. Then I began to realise, when I watched the children more carefully, and watched Janet particularly more carefully, it seemed to be coming from her direction. Her lips weren't moving. Her mouth wasn't moving. Her lips, a slight tremble on her lips, but that's all. But I noticed when the voice spoke, her chest went up and down. So I watched her very carefully. And then, after a while, I challenged her and I said, Janet, that voice is coming from you. She said, oh no, it's not. I said, yes, it's coming from you, Janet. She says, not. I said, if it's not coming from you, where is it coming from? She says, it's coming from behind me. I said, you sure? She said, absolutely certain. That voice is not coming from me, it's coming from behind me. So we did a test later on, sometime later. We did just a simple test, not terribly scientific, but a simple test. We put a microphone in front of her throat, one on the back of her neck. And we found that the one on the back of her neck was louder than the one on her throat. Shouldn't be so.
Did any friends go with you? Was that 53 years ago? Yes, 53. I counted 53. The sooner you get to sleep, the sooner it's going to be quiet. Let me hear you say my name. Come on, let me hear you say my name. That's not my name. Come on, my name's Morris. Let me hear you say it. Morris. Say Dr. Belloff. Come on, let me hear you say that. Come on, let's hear you say Dr. Belloff. Could you close that door down? Say Dr. Belloff. Now, if you squeak the bed, I can't hear you talking. Now, say Dr. Belloff. Come on. Come on, say it for me, Dr. Belloff. Dr. Belloff. Right, that's good. I shut the door. I'm 72 years old. I come from Grimalkin graveyard. And I have right near the church.
I want you to tell me whether you remember what happened to you when you died. Just before you died and just after you died.
Days before I died, I went blind. Then I had an hemorrhage. Bill, if you're there, would you answer me the following question?
What have you done with Denise's 30p?
Why can't Janet fool you?
I'm invisible.
You're invisible? Why are you invisible?
So much H-O-S-T.
Did any friends go with you?
Yes, all of them. All the dogs, 68 dogs.
And what you got 68 dogs for?
So that they can protect me from you killing me.
Look closely at the cinders within the hearth. If you find any that are shaped like a coffin, there may be a death in the family.
Local vet Keith Michael has assured us that the cat will make a full recovery. And finally, tonight's special report investigates a real-life haunting. The residents of this 300-year-old house, set deep in the countryside of West Yorkshire, England, have been experiencing strange phenomena. An apparition of a woman, known as the Nanny, has been seen in various locations around the house, invariably carrying washing in her arms. Local historian Norman Reed told our reporter that local records show that a wet nurse lived here in the 18th century. Witness Mavis Hartley is convinced that the apparition she has seen is the spirit of this woman. We have arranged for Ruth Brewery, a woman with psychic abilities, to visit the house to give her opinion of the ghostly events. She has not spoken to the residents before and has been told nothing of the events. Ruth's visit to the house proved largely uneventful until she entered the small bedroom on the first floor. She made the following statement to our reporter after the event. As soon as I stepped into the bedroom, I felt a wave of oppressive cold come from the eaves and near the fireplace. I knew that this was a place where the spirit had slept. I didn't need to see her to know she was there. You've been watching Viewpoint. I'm Real Searcher. Good night.
I read one case, I think, that was interesting from the point of view that my fellow investigator and myself were somewhat scared. You get blasé about this, but we were in a house, an old house up in the Fens, north of Cambridge, and in a room that nobody would sleep in or live in, because they said funny things happened to them, and they were using it to store furniture, and when they put electricity in the house, they put everything else but in that one room, and we're in there. And sitting there, and we got all the other helpers, actual members of the University Society downstairs, doing a Ouija board, not to communicate, but to get everybody round so that we could control them. And suddenly there's bumps and thumps.
The case at the empty, haunted church, where the team and I went to look because we'd been told by various students and people that they'd seen figures moving in the gloom there. This particular church I didn't know existed, but when we went there, figures did move in the gloom. There were tombstones which had been disturbed. This strange mist filtered into the church. The atmosphere was intensely oppressive. That was probably the most frightening case that we actually went to.
Lots of things have frightened me, but not ghostly things. In the course of investigating supposedly haunted places, I've been down in cellars with no lights on and no torch, just hoping something will come out of the slimy walls. I've slept in several bedrooms where I've been told no one slept there for 20 years, and I sort of go to bed and go to sleep, wishing something spooky would come along. As a child, I can certainly remember seeing apparitional type things and being frightened, but nowadays if I see something like that, I think, oh, there comes an apparition. I think it's my own mind, so it's not remotely frightening. I'm quite happy to go to bed at night, see all kinds of things being created by my mind, and they don't spook me. So the answer is no, but of course it might happen. I might get a terrible shock and one day go to a haunted place and see that ghost that I...
Approached the abbey, walking across the fields, over a fence, looked up, could see the abbey.
Betiscombe Manor is quiet these days, but it was not always so. The villagers in this lonely nook of the Dorset countryside still recalled tales of a terrifying scream that was said to originate from a skull kept in the manor. In 1685, Azariah Pinney, the Lord of Bettiscombe Manor, was banished to the West Indies for his allegiance to the Duke of Monmouth. A man of acute business sense, Pinney made good his exile and prospered in the god-forsaken colony, accruing a vast fortune which was turned over to his heirs on his death. 2 generations were to pass before any of Azariah's kin dared set foot on English soil. It was his grandson, John Frederick, who returned to England in 1734 to reclaim the family seat in Dorset, bearing considerable riches and a Negro servant from the Isles. However, shortly after their arrival in the country, Frederick's manservant, Isaac, was stricken with a malady that racked his body for days and only eased when the wretched fellow approached death. It was on his deathbed that old Isaac, who had served the family well, pleaded with his master that he must be taken back to his homeland for burial. If not, a terrible curse would befall the manor and all who lived therein. A phlegmatic man, John Frederick was not given to superstition, and duly ignored his slave's dying wish, discreetly burying his body in the local churchyard. It was then that the howling came. At first, many thought it a prank played by schoolchildren, defying one another to remain in the churchyard after dark. But when one of the youngsters returned home, ashen-faced and shaking with fear after hearing a strange groan emerge from one of the graves, the games stopped and few would enter the graveyard again, and the wailing continued, louder than ever, a wild, keening sound that chilled the soul and which could be heard for miles around. The villagers knew the source of the shrieking, but Frederick would not heed their desperate pleas and refused to disinter the remains of his servant, and so the howling was joined by tremors and thunderclaps that shook the very foundations of Bettiscombe Manor. It seemed as if Isaac's corpse had risen from his defiled grave and was hammering angrily at the doors and shutters of his former household. If Isaac couldn't rest in peace, neither would his master. The din was appalling, but it had its desired effect, almost. Finally, 2 sleepless months after Isaac's burial, John Frederick wearily succumbed to the inevitable and exhumed the body of his servant. In such haste was the deed done that Isaac's rotting head was rudely detached from his body. Yet rather than return Isaac's complete remains to the West Indies, Frederick shipped his body back for burial, but kept the skull as a ghoulish memento of his recent travails. The skull was deposited in the loft, and the Lord of Bettiscombe Manor retired for an early night, comforted by the belief that he had done all in his power to appease Isaac's vengeful spirit, and a blissful silence descended upon the village once more. And so it stayed, until John Frederick's own death a decade later. However, the new occupant of the manor, William Thornton, had not been appraised of the skull's presence, and upon seeing its ghastly village, had it thrown into a pond behind the house. He instantly learned the error of his hasty actions, as an ear-splitting scream rent the air and drove him to the sanctuary of his manor. Quick were his neighbours to inform him of the nature of the cry, and the penalty for ignoring old Isaac's wishes. But Thornton was a proud man, and steadfastly rejected any attempts to retrieve the skull and let it defile his house again. No matter how much Isaac's ghost bellowed into the night sky or raged against the manor with his phantom fists, Thornton would not yield. Nor would he accept the accusation that Isaac's clamorous protestations were responsible for an unaccountable crop failure that year, or for the mysterious death of livestock in the region. It was to prove a fatal stand. On a bitterly cold January morning, the lord of Bettiscombe Manor was found in a state of collapse by the edge of the pond, dressed only in a sodden nightshirt. Driven mad with fatigue, his spirit had finally broken, and he had stayed up the long night, raking the pond for the accursed skull, to no avail. He spent the rest of his short, tormented life on a sickbed in the wing furthest from the pond, but he could not shut out the damnable screeching. Within a year of taking possession of Bettiscombe Manor, William Thornton, a man of rugged health and fierce temperament, was dead, having faded to a shambling shadow of his former self. After his funeral, held many miles from Isaac's former resting place, a handful of villagers recovered the screaming skull from the pond, stole into Bettiscombe Manor under cover of dark, and restored the dread relic to the loft, and there it languished, content and quiet, for well over 100 years, as each of the manor's subsequent proprietors wisely paid greater heed to the legend of the screaming skull than their ill-fated predecessors. Most would never visit the loft, lest they encounter Isaac's spectre in a less charitable mood. But when Bettiscombe Manor passed into the hands of Charles Pomeroy in the early part of this century, events took a bizarre turn. The new owner, a modern gentleman of liberal disposition, promptly removed the skull, now encrusted in dust and a curiously sticky residue, had it polished, and reinstated the grisly heirloom to a more prominent position in the household. It was a well-meaning gesture and an effort on Pomeroy's part to return some measure of dignity to the memory of a former resident of the manor. He could not have imagined what followed. On the eve of the Great War, a torrent of blood issued from the cracks in Isaac's newly veneered skull, staining the mantelpiece on which it stood, and the blood would not cease. So shocked were visitors to the manor that Pomeroy was forced to return the weeping artifact to the loft. There it remained, reportedly oozing blood, when the outbreak of war was imminent. Peace now reigns at Bettiscombe Manor, but should anyone ever be tempted to remove the skull from its adopted home, old Isaac's spirit will scream the place down.
I don't know. The problem with science is that it does deal with things that can be measured. Like take something apart in a laboratory or measure it or stick things into it or use telescopes to actually ascertain whether there is something out there. And this seems to me to be so diametrically opposed to a scientific approach. How do you actually measure the presence of a ghost, for example? Can you actually film it? Is it possible to record its movements? I don't know. I doubt it. Having said that, though, there is actually a body in existence, a psychic research body that produces a report quite regularly and as scientifically as possible. It would actually go into a house where perhaps they'd suspected there was a ghost or a haunting, and they would actually put this down in print. I suppose as cold and as clinically as possible, but they just actually relate the actual events that took place. And this is actually available in most public libraries for people to go and peruse. So I suspect that in the end, people will actually say, we have had an experience of a ghost, or we have had an experience of something that we can't actually put down in so many words. But there are people who are cataloguing these and saying, it's enough of a phenomenon right across the human race to say we can't dismiss it.
I think it would be very exciting if we had some evidence that ghosts exist. The problem is, I think what's most likely to happen is that we'll go on getting the kinds of so-called evidence that we've had for years and years. That is stories of people seeing things, apparently matching up to how things were in the past, but when you go and check, you can't really be sure and so on. What would really make a difference would be if somebody came up with a plausible sounding theory about ghosts. And most of the theories that I've heard just don't really stand up at all. They involve all kinds of very strange ideas of energy or of vibration or of storage of information, which just don't fit with anything that we understand, and you can't do anything with them. What we need is a theory that will say, right, it's using this kind of energy, it's storing the information in this kind of way, it interacts the brain like this, now let's test it. If it's true, it predicts such and such an effect, let's go and look for that effect. That is how normal science proceeds, by putting up a theory and trying to see whether it can make predictions that come out right. If we had that in the realm of ghosts, we might get somewhere. But it hasn't happened yet. I think it would be very interesting if it did.
I think we're very close to it, because, you see, the team and I are all skeptics. That is, we doubt, but we accept sensible evidence. Whereas people who say they're skeptics and don't believe, of course, are not skeptics. At least they're not scientists, because a scientist has an open mind. They're dogmatic. They're paranoid disbelievers. We're the true skeptics. We doubt in the absence of evidence.
It's got to be done much more accurately, with a lot more equipment, a lot more analysis, and I think more important than anything else, with all that backup, the psychology of the people involved is very, very important. We don't know what causes this, but it does seem to be linked to, in many ways, people's beliefs and the circumstances they find themselves in other words, the mental state. I don't mean crackers, their mental outlook.
If the clock is wound well but still stops, count it as a bad omen. If
I can't say that every single ghost that's ever happened can be explained away. That's impossible. All I can do is to provide alternative explanations for why people see things. And from psychology we know a lot about the way people imagine things. People describe me as all sorts of horrible things.
After cashing up on an evening shift, I put the float in its tray in the filing cabinet, locked the filing cabinet and left the restaurant. Coming back the following morning, went to take the cash tray out of the filing cabinet, and the money had been removed from the filing cabinet and placed in little piles underneath the tray. A couple of other instances that have happened in the restaurant, not directly affecting me, were we had builders in the restaurant earlier in the year, and they let themselves in the back door, and the posts that arrived that morning had been neatly stacked halfway up the stairs. As the post arrives at 7 in the morning and the night shift finishes at 1 o'clock in the morning, there's no explanation why that happened. Also with the builders, they had an Alsatian dog which used to accompany them when they were doing their work, and they were doing some work in the bar upstairs in the restaurant, and the dog was taken up to the restaurant, up to the bar, and it refused to stay in there. It whimpered a lot, and ran down the stairs and would not go anywhere near the bar.
Have you checked your reflection recently?
Well, originally I was actually talking at adult education lectures on the subject of parapsychology. My background's in psychology, but para is a Greek word for outside of or beyond psychology, you see. Telepathy, things like that, poltergeist effects. And one night I told the class that somebody rang me up saying they thought they had a ghost or a poltergeist, and everybody wanted to come and see. And from that small beginning, a group of us remained, and we became the Ghostbusters, you see. Well, in a way, we're rather similar. I mean, we didn't set out to be similar, or even, we didn't call ourselves Ghostbusters, you know. That was a media name, which we think is good fun. Why shouldn't you have fun? How do we differ? I don't think we differ a lot. We try and find, we don't charge. They charge, and I mean, if we go a long distance, we have to have our expenses covered. We don't charge for the investigation per se. Well, we've had a lot of interesting cases. We've had a nerve-wracking case looking for sort of vampires, you know, something like at Highgate Cemetery in London.
Physical changes, sudden cold, spots, breezes, figures that appear and then disappear, objects being moved, vibrations, sudden wafts of perfume. So we want to make sure, if we can, that these things actually happen and record them and see if there's any way in which they're cyclic.
most ghosts look absolutely normal. You can't distinguish them from ordinary people very often. They may be transparent. It came about because some ghosts are seen as just luminous blobs, and sometimes maybe you would see a couple of holes. There's a famous photograph of a ghost that has a couple of, sort of eye holes in a sheet and that. So there's a little bit of evidence that sometimes they might indeed appear like that. But I can tell you that most ghosts are indistinguishable from people, and indeed, unless your attention is drawn to the fact, you often don't realise that you've seen a ghost.
Well, the popular image of a ghost is that it's something sort of whitish or greyish, transparent, with no feet. It sort of hovers along without touching the floor, and often hooded or veiled in some way. And I think this is what you'd expect if ghosts are coming from people's own minds and yet are sort of mentally projected out into the real world. There's a clash between seeing what's there and mixing it up with your own visual image. So that I think this is exactly what you'd expect, this kind of transparency. The feet are tricky because you've actually got to connect them to the floor, so it's easier if your brain's constructing a mental image to leave out the feet and have it sort of float along. And of course, if you haven't got much information and it's just a vague shape, it will look kind of hooded and monk-like, hence the grey ladies and the monks and so on of the traditional ghost. I think it just reflects the fact that they're mental images.
Here is a photograph taken on the Bakerloo line in the tunnel, and we think it took place, the actual photograph took place somewhere around under Madden Tussauds, because the Bakerloo line runs under there. This was taken by a lady who is married to a Chinese gentleman whose nephew had come over on holiday, and they were on the underground train when this lady took a photograph of her young nephew. He had a camera in his hand and she took a photograph of him. When the photograph came out, there in the window of the train in the background is a picture of a man in an electric chair. Now that picture we found out was an exact duplicate of the figure in the Chamber of Horrors in Madden Tussauds, and he was you may not remember, but before the war in the 1930s, the aviator Lindbergh, his child was kidnapped and killed, and that was the man who they said did it, and he was executed for his trouble. The only difference between that and the model in the Madden Tussauds is the sparks coming out of the hand. Now that's been examined very closely by experts. We're almost certain it's not a poster, and anyway, what's a poster doing in the tunnel of the underground? Well, you can draw your own conclusions. But when I interviewed this lady, and I said to her, well, after a little conversation, I said to her, by the way, what's your hobbies? She says criminology. So have we got an example of what we call thoughtography, and we know this is possible because we've had examples of it, of people transferring their thoughts onto film. Here is a photo, two pictures here. One is taken by a grandmother of a small do she had in Halifax, in the Liberal Club there. I believe it was a birthday party for her grandson, and she took some photographs of these entertainers on the stage. Now most of the photographs on there are perfectly normal, but in between these normal photographs is a photograph of, up here behind one of the entertainers, a picture of her mother and her stepfather, who've been dead for 5 years. Now I asked her when I started to question her on this, I said, have you got any other pictures of your mother and stepfather? She said, yes. I said, are they similar? She said, yes. And she showed it to me. The picture was very similar to that, but the mother was wearing a different dress, and she was about 10 years, the mother and the father were about 10 years older and had white hair. So here we have a duplication, literally, of a photograph that was taken much later in life, and yet they appear much younger. Quite extraordinary. No explanation for that. Here, this one was taken in some caves in the south of France. The woman who took this picture said that she was alone when she took this picture. She took it from a gallery. There are other people in this. She was with a party of people. They'd moved on, and she took the photograph on her own there, standing by the railings. When the picture came out, there was this white cloaked figure there, with its hand on the handrail, and on the hands are a couple of rings. This is the classic type apparition. Two pictures here. Two pictures here. This was taken by an elderly lady in a private wood in Oxford. Now this is another one of those strange and very telling photographs. She took a picture of her son, or was it a son or was it a nephew? I'm sorry, at the moment I just can't remember. Anyway, she took a photograph of this gentleman with his girlfriend in the woods. Nobody else in the woods, just herself. Private woods, remember, again. She took the first photograph together like that, then she took another photograph of the couple apart. Now in this one where the couple are apart is a figure moving through the girl. Here you see the skirt with the foot, the bottom, there's another foot behind, and the blouse on the top of the figure is actually moving through the girl. The lady concerned who took the photograph thinks that he was a recently deceased member of her family. This was taken by a man in Covent Garden, taken a picture of his child here, and his wife and the young child in the pram at the background. Here, going across in front, you see a figure moving in a very, very unusual manner, leaning forward, without any legs. And the mother says that she doesn't remember anybody going across in front of her, but even if somebody did go across, it's very unlikely they would have gone across in that angle, which is quite artificial, and without any legs. And there is a blow-up of that picture, the central part of it. This was taken by a Here we have two photographs taken in the Austrian Tyrol by a group of English people who were on holiday for a week. At the end of their holiday, they decided to have a bit of a do in the evening, and they were all sitting around a table having drinks and watching the floor show. And when the floor show was finished, Mr. Todd, the man who took the photograph, he is, by the way, a garage man by profession. He's an amateur photographer, doesn't know, he doesn't handle a camera better than anybody else. He set up his camera in the table in front on delay, 10-second delay, went back, sat down, and the camera went off. But the flash didn't go off. So he immediately got up, went back to the table, had a look at the camera, couldn't see anything wrong, reset the delay, went back, sat down. This time the camera went off with the flash. Well, anyway, eventually went home, had a look through all the photographs he took on holiday, put them in the drawer, and that was that. Sometime later, one of the other people in the party came to visit them and said, "Oh, by the way, can I have a look at our photographs we took on holiday?" Fine, okay. So he took them out of the drawer and gave them to her. And she's looking through these photographs. And suddenly she stops in her tracks and says, "Who's that? Let's have a look and see who that is." Here is the second photograph. And the second photograph, as you see, are just the people sitting round the table. Nothing particular about it at all laughing and joking. The first photograph, which appears without the flash, is something quite different. Because right in the middle of the tables, with the people surrounding them at the back, is another figure sitting there. 15% too big, slightly out of focus, when everybody else is in focus except a woman on the left here and the man who have moved slightly, but she is out of focus, I'm assured by the photographic experts that is from because it's blurred, not because she moved. Say she's 15% too big. She can be seen quite clearly through the beer glasses on the table, and she is quite solid. Who is she? Nobody knows. Nobody knows where she came from, where she went to. But in that fraction of a second that camera was exposed, or perhaps it may be in 2 or 3 seconds, because if the flash didn't go off, then the camera would take a longer exposure. It would compensate. So for the couple of seconds that camera was exposed, she appeared in the film and then disappeared. Nobody saw her, nobody was aware of her. I have affidavits from all these people. I went to see all these people. I questioned them, and I gave them a questionnaire, in fact, which they filled out. Everybody, I'm sure, was telling them. Here we have two photographs.
If you want some advice to get ahead, there's more to the laboratory than meets the eye. If you want If you cross the North Downs in the county of Surrey, just east of Guildford, you will come to the tiny hamlet of Shear. Continue south for another mile, and you will enter Hurt Wood, an ancient and lush forest on the edge of the downs. Beneath its heavy canopy of oak and ash, deep in its wooded folds, a clear and tranquil pool will present itself, its banks lined with willow, its rim turning to moss. This is the silent pool of legend, whose lower depths hold a violent and brooding secret. In Saxon times, the silent pool was a godsend for weary travellers who chanced upon it when losing their way in the forest. For Emma and Philip, who lived and worked in the woods, it was far more. It was their secret place where they could forget the long labours of the day and bathe in the pool's placid waters. The daughter and son of Benjamin, the local woodsman, the pair were inseparable, and they had taken over many of the daily chores after the recent death of their mother. Emma, the eldest, was a striking beauty, who reminded Benjamin so much of his dear wife. Now approaching womanhood, she would soon marry and raise a family of her own. Philip was a lad of strong heart and limb and devoted to his sister. The household was beginning to recover from the grief that had stricken it earlier that year, when the appearance of a dark stranger changed their lives forever. On an uncommonly hot day in autumn, a finely attired nobleman, hopelessly lost and in need of a drink to slake his powerful thirst, stumbled upon the woodcutter's hut. Unprepared for such a visitor, but knowing the dangerous caprice of such men, Benjamin reluctantly entertained him, sharing what little refreshment he had with his taciturn guest. While Philip attended the patrician's steed, Emma served their uninvited caller the last of their water, and then eagerly took her leave to fetch more from her secret refuge. On arriving at the pool, flushed and breathless, Emma felt no compunction to hurry back, but instead disrobed and entered the water's cool, inviting embrace. So enchanted was she by the serene beauty of her surrounds that she failed to hear a horse approach until it was too late. The rider burst from the woods and reined in his steed at the water's edge, near Emma's discarded clothes, uttering not a word. It was her father's mysterious guest, and now she turned abruptly from him, clasping her hands around her naked frame. She pleaded with him for her guns, but the man made no move or sound, merely staring at her with an intensity that terrified Emma. And then, without warning, he spurred his mount into the pool towards her. Emma's pulse quickened, and she struggled further into the silent waters, though she could not swim. The stranger ignored her entreaties and drove his horse forward. Emma now feared for her life as much as her virtue, and so she waded even further into the pool, the waters growing darker and colder with every step, until her toes could no longer feel the bottom, and still the horseman advanced. Sobbing convulsively and now feeling a numbness creep up her flailing legs, Emma screamed as loud as her tightening lungs would allow, instinctively reaching out to the mysterious intruder. The rider merely removed a glove and flung it with casual disdain in the direction of the drowning girl's outstretched hands. Emma let out one more frantic yell before her mouth filled with water. Deep in the woods, Philip heard his sister scream and rushed as fast as his limbs could carry him in the direction of the cry. When he reached the pool, Philip could at first see only the stranger on his steed a short way out from the bank. But then he caught sight of Emma thrashing wildly in the deepest part of the pool. Wading in without a second thought, Philip reached his sister, whose energy had been all but sapped by the icy waters which now enveloped them both. Yet he could not keep her head above water, and his own strength began to fail him. In one last desperate lunge, he tried to push his sister towards the bank, but he fell back under the effort, and the pool's inky depths dragged them down, slowly and inexorably. They never surfaced again. The stranger scratched his beard idly, turned his horse, and rode off into the forest. Behind him, the waters of the pool stilled over like a glassy sheet, leaving no trace of the tragedy that took place barely moments ago. When his children did not return home that evening, Benjamin desperately searched for them in all the places he knew they liked to dally, and in time came upon the silent pool, but he could see nothing there, and returned home distraught and tired. He would redouble his efforts tomorrow. And so the woodsman continued his search, time and again returning to the pool, until, on one occasion, something caused him to linger by the bank. The noonday sun was just clearing the tops of the trees overhead, its rays playing across the becalmed surface of the pool, when Benjamin was momentarily blinded by the glint of something bright on the far bank. He hurried around to the other side, but when he got there, what he saw broke his heart, and he wept like a child. There before him, bobbing near the water's edge, were the pale, bloated bodies of his children, still bonded together after death. He waded in and began to pull them back out when he noticed, locked in Emma's frozen grip, a silver gauntlet, which had to be prized from her fingers for him to look at it more closely. Standing waist-deep in the accursed pool, with the bodies of his dead children floating beside him, Benjamin examined the crest on the glove, and his body shook with helpless rage. For the owner of the glove was not only the self-same lord to whom he gave succor some days before, but also none other than Prince John, Regent of England. His evil was beyond punishment by any other than God, the same God who had now taken his whole family from him. Do not tarry long at the edge of the silent pool, for you might witness the spirit of the drowning maiden rising from her watery grave, a chilling scream on her lips. There she will stare you dead in the eye, and in a heartbeat rush towards you across the pool's shimmering, hushed surface.
I was a very sceptical young man at school here in Cambridge. I thought I knew all the answers. Science would explain everything. You know, and why did people believe in ghosts? Absolute rubbish. I mean, scientific age. But I got a mother at home who was a very sensible little woman, and she seemed to be able to forecast what was going to happen. It was a contradiction, you see. I knew my mother was sensible. She wasn't nuts. And yet, somehow or other, science seemed to explain everything. So I thought, well, I don't know, this is odd. And I went out to India, and I was in the Navy, and I saw some very peculiar things out there. The most peculiar thing, I was told that we were all on leave up in the Nilgiri Hills, which is South India, 6,000 feet up. And I was told that there was a fakir, a holy man, up in the mountains. Anyway, cut a long story short, I went up to see him. It was a long climb up this hill, and there he was on a flat piece of ground, with a sheer drop on the other side. I had to go through a gully. And he knew I was there. And he said, what do you want? And I said, I hear you can do miracles. And he said, all right, okay, but you're far too materialistic. But anyway, I'll give you what you want. Look over the hills, my son. About 70. Look over the hills. I thought, I'd better pacify this silly old twit. I'm looking over the hills. He's standing here. And I think, that's funny. And I turn and he's not there. He's the other side of a stream rushing down. Now, I was a boxer in those days and very fit, and I couldn't have done it. And I thought, how'd you get there? Cunning old devil, ropes? Hell, couldn't do it. I can't do it. And he's saying, look over the hills. And I'm looking, look over the hills, and I thought, I better look over the hills. What? And then the voice says, well, my son, did that entertain you? And he's back to me. It shook me rigid. I was very arrogant to start with. When I went down that hill from that little episode, I wasn't half as cocky as when I went up.
My views about ghosts and hauntings, and indeed about many other psychic phenomena, have changed dramatically since I first got interested more than 20 years ago. When I first came to know about these things, and I read books about ghosts and I heard all these stories about them, it seemed to me obvious to believe them, and I did believe them. And I started to theorize about, where could ghosts be coming from? Could they be, somehow imbibed in the walls and giving out vibrations? And I made up lots of theories of my own, and because I believed all the stories. After a few years of doing research in parapsychology and doing my own experiments and so on, I began to become far more skeptical, simply because I didn't find psychic phenomena in the lab. But I still thought, well, out there there are ghosts and so on. And then I began investigating, going to haunted houses, being called on when people had poltergeists and so on. And gradually the same thing happened there. The more I began to learn about them, the more I saw things at first hand, the more I really questioned people carefully, the more it seemed to me that psychological phenomena and not psychic or paranormal phenomena lay behind the ghosts.
The answer lies in Easter. The answer lies in Easter. Look closely at the cinders within the hearth. If you find any that are shaken,
What we have here is a computer system that is monitoring a number of sensors which are on the end of wires. So this is one of them which is nearby. This is a temperature sensor, a small very sensitive sensor which is feeding information into the computer, which is then being recorded and displayed on the screen as a trace. Now if I grab hold of this, you'll see the temperature go up along that curve there. And as the temperature goes up, it's recorded and into the computer's memory, and we can take it off onto a floppy disk and then analyse the data at a later stage. And what is more, this machine will give a warning if any of the readings change fairly drastically.
Well, we've become rather conscious of equipment. In the past, what people used to do is they go along with a notebook, pencil, camera, tape recorder, and mainly common sense. It's a difficult question to answer, but I'll try. And because I'm a little bit biased, I'm more interested in the spontaneous cases because they've been going on for years and they're still there and they still need answering.
This is a little device that's designed to detect the charged ions in the air. Now these ions can be either negative or positive. Positive is usually bad, it gives people bad impressions of the atmosphere of a place. Negative is usually good, it makes people feel quite good. So an excess of positive ions in a room would cause people to feel it was unpleasant, spooky, had a bad atmosphere and so on. So we will check that out using this piece of equipment to see if there's any sort of reason why people might be feeling bad about a place anyway. And it could be that a ghost has some form of ionising field that causes people to see it in the way that ionised air will glow. So there could be some association, so we use this to check that. And looking around here, I'm afraid we're getting no unusual readings at all in this area where the ghost was seen.
This fascinating piece of machinery was constructed in case we needed to deal with a terrifying entity of some sort. Because people often say to us, have you ever been frightened with what you're doing? We've never actually been frightened, but you never know. If we saw an entity, we could in fact, literally, like the Ghostbusters, we could sort of, fire a beam of light and we might have an epileptic ghost if we did that, but it is a very real piece of machinery. Now, it's very complicated, but in brief, on the side of the machinery, we have here a GSR machine, galvanic skin response machine, which you hold in one hand, and if you see something that's frightening, you could sweat. You might not realise you were sweating, but there would be a response in the palm of your hand. This then emits a high-pitched buzz, and if you felt uncomfortable, you think, my God, people have reported a sinister presence there, but I don't actually see anything. You hold this, and if you began to feel uncomfortable, it would be responded, you get a sound here, and then if you wanted to, even though you couldn't see it with your physical eyes, you could nevertheless upset it with that. It's very difficult with anything like this commonly to decide what is, as it were, subjective or objective. It's something that you think you're going to feel, or is there something really there? On one occasion we used it when there was something really there. We used it in a deserted church. We fired the beam of light at a swirling green, ominous mist, which exploded into trillions of glistening lights and rushed out of the door and disappeared. Now, we saw it, believe it or believe it not, that doesn't matter to me. But the fact is, it came in useful. We liked the machine, we developed it, and it's fun. But the galvanic skin response machine does help you to decide if you are actually physically responding to something anyway. Now, there's a lot more that could be said, but it's probably beyond the scope of what we're recording just now. And what we have here is a wand sensor. It's a type of thermometer. And the useful thing about that is not only is it on a long lead so we can investigate temperatures physically, but because it has an illuminated digital readout, it's very useful for seeing even in the dark. And the change of temperature is noticed directly. Now, we can if a report has been such as here, when there's a phantom has been seen under this particular beam, we can find out if a temperature change is associated with it, you see. It may or may not be. So we can look. Somebody said, there was something on this chair there. So we can actually leave it. Now, we can actually leave the thing, so we're not disturbing anything. We can go to where the readout is, even if it were in another room, because we can have the wire as long as we wish and see what's taking place at a distance. It's a good idea. So it's simple in essence, but it's the interpretation of the data that it gives us that is important, you see.
G-H-O-S-G.
We meet again, my friend. I'm afraid that I have misled you slightly. My life ended long ago, and I've become part of this house. I now know the answers to all its mysteries, but I cannot share them with you. You must make your own decisions about ghosts and spirits, and wait until you leave this world to find the real answers. I wish you good luck with your quest. Are you sure you want to leave the house now? Remember the words of the Spirit. Remember the words of the Spirit. Justice is often blind, and there are some who would sooner take the law into their own hands than see a crime go unpunished. The case of Nell Cook, the servant of a canon of Canterbury Cathedral, plainly illustrates the dangers of setting oneself up as judge, jury, and executioner. Nell Cook tended house for the new canon of Canterbury Cathedral as best she could, and was rewarded for her diligence and devotion by deceit and gross impropriety. She had not always felt this way, and when the canon gave his first mass in the cathedral, she was suitably impressed by the character of her new employer. The old canon, who mercifully passed away after many years of ill health, was a kind but ineffectual cleric, more concerned with getting his meals on time than spreading the word of the Lord. Now, here before her was clearly a man of passion, who had directed his considerable energies and charisma in the service of the church, and yet there was something about the new canon, like the way he would never look her in the eye before he went to visit parishioners who would sought advice in spiritual matters, or his often extreme moodiness and irritability after returning from some of these calls. Nell put this down to his youth and passionate temperament, but she would soon find out the depths of his feelings. The canon was a man who kept odd hours, and it was difficult for Nell to arrange meals at set times. One evening, after watching the stew she had laboured over all afternoon grow cold on the dresser, she decided to wait for him to come home so that she could broach the matter forthwith. Late that night, Nell was drifting in and out of sleep in the kitchen when she heard the scuffle of feet and whispered giggling from the drawing-room upstairs. She couldn't believe it was the canon. She crept up the stairs to catch a glimpse of the intruders, and was sickened to the stomach by the sight that greeted her eyes. The young canon, obviously inebriated, was on the settle, being very familiar with a young woman. But the real shock came when the priest's companion turned around, revealing herself as none other than his own niece. Nell could bear the scene no longer, and stole off to her own room to a fitful rest. In the morning, the niece was nowhere to be seen, and the canon seemed in particularly high spirits. His hypocrisy appalled Nell, and she had to take her leave with some feeble excuse about tending to something on the stove. In the kitchen, her sanctuary, Nell brooded over the night's events. She decided to bide her time, as this might be isolated indiscretion, not uncommon amongst men of the cloth. But deep down she feared the worst, and her instincts were soon borne out. The canon's niece started making more frequent calls on her uncle at his quarters, and their conduct together became more brazen and unforgivable. It was not something Nell could discuss with anyone else, so she resolved to deal with the matter herself. One evening, when she expected the canon's niece for dinner, she expressly made the priest his favourite meal, mutton pie, emptying a bottle of arsenic into the filling, and grimly smiling at the irony of it all. After serving the pie to them, Nell waited by the dining-room door, wondering at the effects of her special repast, but nothing happened. After the meal, which seemed to go on forever, the canon congratulated her on an excellent dinner, as usual, and said that he and his niece would retire to the study where she would help him work on tomorrow's sermon. Nell hurried to the kitchen to check that she had used the right bottle, when she heard a cry from above, the study. The poison must be doing its mischief, and so Nell took her time responding to the desperate pleas for help. When she reached the room, she found the canon and his niece writhing on the floor in agony, foam the colour of sage forming around their mouths, and their eyes wide with terror and supplication. But Nell simply watched them with a curious detachment, as if none of this was really happening, bade them good night, and retired to bed. Yet her awakening was violent, arresting her from a deep slumber. Upon opening her eyes, she saw a crowd of people in her room, all speaking in agitated tones, and the most vehement amongst them was the man now shaking her roughly by the shoulders. Still drowsy, Nell could not fathom what her assailant was babbling, but when he mentioned the poison, the hairs rose on the back of her neck, and she recalled her actions of the previous night. It all seemed like a dream. Now, fully roused, she attempted to explain, to defend herself, but those gathered in her room were well past listening and only sought vengeance for the slaying of their priest. Nell was dragged from bed and into the streets, where the people who had once been her friends and neighbours turned on her with a viciousness that was breathtaking. Stones caught her in the head and chest, forcing her to her knees, blood pouring freely from a gash on her cheek, and still it rained stones, pounding her into the ground, her arms uselessly hanging by her sides, and then succumbed to the darkness. If only that were the end of it. On regaining consciousness, Nell found herself at the bottom of a deep pit, looking up at her tormentors, some of whom had shovels in their hands. She desperately tried to raise herself, railing against her attackers and accusing the priest of terrible sins, but their response to this blasphemy was a clump of earth that hit her hard in the face, filling her mouth and choking off her appeal. And then the next mound of dirt landed on her, and the next, until her body was covered by damp, cool soil. The last thing she saw through the clod of mud clinging to her cheeks was the poison bottle being thrown into the grave with her. And then the darkness truly closed in. Forever. The passage between the old infirmary cloister and the Green Court in Canterbury Cathedral is known as the Dark Entry, and Nell Cook's spirit is said to wander through this foreboding corridor, lamenting the injustice of her fate. It is also said that any who look upon the wretched apparition will soon taste death themselves. If you have ever broken a glass whilst drinking, you will have experienced an omen of death.
Well, I think the simple, almost a dictionary definition of what are ghosts would be something along the lines of a disembodied spirit of somebody who's obviously died.
I think a ghost is something constructed by one's own mind, a mental image, a mental construction that is seen in the context of the ordinary world, an eyes open apparition. It's easy enough when you shut your eyes to have mental images against a blank background. It's harder for most people to have them in front of the filing cabinet, the piano, whatever it is. But I think that's precisely what a ghost is, and that's why they look the way they do.
But this particular night, a perfectly ordinary night, I went to bed around 11ish, which was normal for us. Went into the room, went to sleep, you know, perfect, nothing odd about the night. The room was dark because it was quite high up, so the street lighting didn't shine a bright light in there, but you could distinguish the shapes of all the furniture, and colours were in terms of shades of grey and black. You couldn't have picked out colour in the light. Anyway, I'd gone to sleep. I don't know how long I'd been asleep or quite when I woke up. It was still dark, and I woke up and I sort of just laid there and I thought, oh God, what's wrong with me? I felt really ill. I felt sort of slightly sick, slightly feverish, just very, very odd. And I sort of laid there feeling uneasy, and I thought, God, I'm really ill, there's something really wrong. Thinking I'm going to have to phone the other co-worker at the other house to get somebody to come round. I turned over in the bed, I'd been facing the wall. I turned over and had my eyes open, and there was a figure of a woman stood maybe 2-3 feet away from the bed. She seemed quite tall, but then I was laid down in the bed and she was stood up. Her silhouette was very simple, sort of shape, long dress, sort of seemed to be quite high-necked. Her face I could distinguish was paler, but I couldn't see her features clearly, and her head was in my direction, and I very much felt that she was looking at me, and I was absolutely petrified. I was really, really scared, and she just didn't move. She just stood there. I mean, I can't remember whether her arms were by her side or in front of her. She was very still. And I didn't even debate in my head, you're not seeing this. I knew I was seeing it, and I was very frightened. And the problem was, I was completely trapped. The bed was in the corner of the room, the door was sort of over here, and she was stood in between. And there's no way I was going to get out of that bed to pass her or even attempt to go around her. I can't express how frightened I was. So I just got my head under the duvet, and I stayed under the duvet, sweated it out, you know, until I thought morning must be here, and I kept sort of peering out, you know, waiting for the light to come. The light came, I got my clothes, and I left that room. Next day, of course, at 9 o'clock in the morning, the co-worker from the other house came round, and it had really shaken me up. You know, I was still sort of feeling strange and very, very depressed, and the feeling from her was one of total desolation. And I just felt so depressed, and I'm not a depressive person at all. And I said to the other co-worker, I'd actually told him I'd had a dream, because I'd decided at this point it must have been a nightmare, a dream. And I told him, and just I couldn't sleep last night, and this happened, I saw this, I was so scared. And he just looked at me and said, don't say any more, you've got to speak to this guy called Ken. And he wouldn't sort of elaborate. He said, wait till Ken comes in this afternoon, you know, to take over. So I waited, this guy came in, and I said to him, I said, you know, I think I had this really weird dream, dreamt that I saw a ghost, I think. And he said, oh, what did she look like? And I knew when he said that, what did she look like, that he'd seen it. So I described what I'd seen, and he and the other co-workers sat there as well, just smiling all the time, and apparently every detail tallied. But this guy, Ken, had seen her much clearer. He'd watched her, he hadn't been as frightened as I was, and he watched her disappear through the wall. And the second time he saw her was in broad daylight. There was a full-length mirror on the wall. He had his foot on a chair, tying his shoelace one morning, looked up to sort of just fluff his hair, and there she was in the reflection of the mirror, and she just disappeared. She melted away, she didn't move away from him. And as I say, every detail tallied, though his description was much clearer because he'd seen her in daytime. And I never slept in that room again. I wouldn't sleep. There was a smaller sort of cupboard, and I slept in that. I wouldn't go in that room again because I was so frightened.
And it's no good our friendly scientists saying it's all hallucination, because it isn't. And I'm inclined to think that when people say it's all hallucination or rubbish, they find the problem too difficult to solve, and that's one of the challenges. Solving it, explaining it. It may be that we will never explain it. Perhaps there is another dimension, perhaps these things are from spirits, perhaps there is a life after death, perhaps people do come back. I'm not too happy with that one, but if you're an investigator, you've got to balance it.
On one occasion we used it when there was something really there. We used it in a deserted church. We fired the beam of light.
There are some for whom death holds no dominion, for whom a visitation from the grim reaper is simply an opportunity to challenge the Dark Lord's presumptuous presence. Sir James Lowther, the first Earl of Lonsdale, was one such man, whose spirit was sustained in life, as it was after death, by sheer malevolence and an indomitable will. Lord Lonsdale, or Wicked Jimmy, as he was better known, was an eccentric and haughty aristocrat whose tyranny knew no bounds, a sinister figure to many of his contemporaries. His greed for power in both business and politics was rapacious, and it was a foolish peasant who did not meet his criminal extortion of grain and livestock. The unlucky individual would be flogged mercilessly until Lowther grew bored of the amusement. He was also a man of unbridled passions, and this was to prove his ruin. Despite his overweening authority and fearsome temper, Lonsdale was trapped in an unhappy arranged marriage, and engaged in unwise dalliances outside his ancestral home of Lowther Castle. His amorous attentions eventually fell on Sarah Cook, the handsome daughter of one of Lonsdale's tenant farmers. But as Sarah was considered of common stock and below his social standing, he was forced to keep her as his mistress in lavish style at his manor house in Hampshire. By and by, his love for Sarah grew, softening his mood and bringing much unaccustomed joy into his life, but it was not to last. In the winter of 1790, Sarah fell unaccountably ill and died at the manor. There was no warning and no time to grieve, and so the Lord of Lonsdale reverted to his old ways and simply refused to accept her demise. Sarah's cold, stiffening body was left on the bed next to him, much to the disgust of Lowther's servants, who were forced to play along with this gruesome charade or face dismissal. For the first few days, the chambermaids cleaned and dressed the deceased and brought her down to dinner when their master returned from business. The two of them would be served their evening meal at the same time as usual, but manoeuvring the cutlery between the corpse's frozen fingers was a grim and nauseating chore for the young laird who attended table. But soon no amount of perfume could disguise the sickly stench of death, as Sarah's putrefying flesh slipped free of its bony scaffold. In due course, the servants could bear it no longer, and left Lowther alone with his skeletal sweetheart. Wicked Jimmy then had the body placed inside a glass-fronted coffin so that he could gaze upon what was left of the face that had once so bewitched him. The days would drag by interminably, and he longed to rush back and be with Sarah, who would listen patiently to his stories of the day's progress and his overtures of love, all the while staring at him with vacant sockets and smiling her grisly smile. He didn't need her to speak. He knew what was in her heart. But the inevitable could not be put off forever. As the body rotted and frayed in its bower of glass, Lowther was exhorted by the few acquaintances who dared visit him now to dispose of the body. It was not right for Sarah to be denied a consecrated burial. Her spirit could never be at rest. And so, 2 months after her death, Lowther buried his beloved at Paddington Cemetery in London. Wicked Jimmy, the scourge of the Westmoreland countryside, returned to Lowther Castle a broken man. Gone was the rambunctious despot, to be replaced by a desolate figure who suffered chronic bouts of depression and took to wandering aimlessly through the nearby woods for days on end. His wife had little option but to remain by his side, but his business languished and the estate fell into decay. He died in 1802, and there were few tears shed at his funeral. But Lowther could not resist one final affront. As the lid was about to be placed on top of his coffin, Wicked Jimmy suddenly sat up, eyes blazing. A sharp hiss of air issued from his dead lips. The tremendous force of his movement knocked the attending vicar off his feet and caused a gasp of horror to break out from the assembled mourners. Wicked Jimmy had risen from the grave like some demented Lazarus to strike terror into the hearts of his neighbours once more. However, a collective sigh of relief shuddered through the gathering when, having had the last word, Sir James Lowther sank back into his casket, which was hurriedly nailed shut. But if the people of Westmoreland thought that was the last they would know of the bad lord, they were sorely mistaken. Lowther Hall was the first to bear the full brunt of his homecoming. The upper floors shook violently as his ghost strode about in a rage that forced those few kinsmen who had remained in the castle to cower in the chambers below. Worst of all, though, was the dreadful bellowing. Sir James's booming voice, which terrified those at the receiving end of his ire when he was alive, now threatened to shake the crumbling edifice of Lowther Castle to the ground. But he would not confine his hauntings to his erstwhile residence, and spread his new reign of terror to the surrounding countryside. Dressed in black, thoroughly dishevelled and sporting a manic gleam in his eye, the first Earl of Lonsdale drove a spectral carriage pulled by demonic chargers through the quiet lanes bounding his estate. None would forget Wicked Jimmy in a hurry. Death may have hauled the physical form of Sir James Lowther, defiant till the end, into the void, but his spirit would not be denied. Having been cheated of the great love of his life, he would not rest until all had felt his anguish. And the bad lord refuses to be silenced still. Dame Elizabeth Hoby wished only the very best for her three sons. As a member of the court of Queen Elizabeth I, and a scholar of outstanding merit herself, she was determined that her offspring would not embarrass the family name, and thus they received the finest tutelage money and influence could buy. Under Elizabeth's strict governance, the minds of her two eldest boys, James and John, grew bright and agile, taking to tests and puzzles with an aptitude that delighted her. They were only too painfully aware of the consequences if they did not perform well. They had only to listen at the door of their mother's study when she was disciplining her youngest son, William, who sadly did not share his brother's intellectual gifts. The sound of the cane striking William's limbs and that of their mother's pitiless taunts was chilling, and they learnt to avoid her wrath. William was not so lucky. It often seemed to William that he had been born into the wrong family. A thin, pallid child, he envied his brother's talents and handsome features, neither of which had been passed on to him. Of his father he remembered little, only that he often bore the brunt of his wife's scolding, as cruel as any caning William had ever received, with an unnatural calm that drove his mother into even greater fits of invective. When he died, the house took on an altogether more foreboding air. Once his mother must have felt as the father did, as she had arranged for all manner of physicians to examine the boy, presumably to determine his lineage or his sanity. And then there were the foreign clerics, no doubt commissioned to drive out any mischievous demons which may have taken up residence in the lad, but to no avail. Whilst the more generous claimed that there was something not right in the boy's head, none could deter Elizabeth from her unshakable conviction that William was simply lazy and maliciously stubborn. As for William himself, he always knew there was something wrong inside, but no one asked him. He would spend hours staring at a page in a book, concentrating with all the mental vigour he could summon, and yet the words would make no sense. The tutors would persevere for a time, and even his brothers, in a charitable moment, might offer assistance, but still the words would make no sense. Before his eyes the letters swam, shuffled, and pranced about, doing anything but sitting still on the page long enough for him to decipher them. As for the sums, well, that was like reading, only worse. 2 + 2 seldom equaled 4, except when it was counted out whilst the cane was being brought down on his white knuckles. But the very worst was writing. Squeezing hard on the quill his mother had specially purchased for all her sons, William carefully dipped it in the inkpot and brought the nib to the blank page, cupping the falling ink into his other hand. Yet when it met the paper, he could only manage a few tense scrawls before the nib invariably got caught in the thick fibres, and he tore the first sheet, blotting the rest of his exercise book in the process. He sobbed convulsively over his shame, but it only brought unwelcome attention to his handiwork. Sometimes he fought back the tears and managed to secrete the stained, sodden books through a gap in the floorboards beneath his desk, but more often than not he was caught defacing the page, the punishment for which was severe. The cane sang briefly before it bit into his flesh, and then a throbbing numbness passed over him. Afterwards, his mother sent him to consider his crimes in the cool, dark room at the top of the stairs. On the day of examination, when the boys were to be judged for their future placement in the halls of learning, William pleaded with his mother that he was unprepared for such a test, but she would have none of it, insisting the experience would focus the boy's mind and energies and put an end once and for all to his willful laziness. James and John acquitted themselves with distinction, as expected, while young William struggled mightily with his tasks, but succeeded only in covering his books with illegible scribbles and oceans of ink. Racked with anxiety, the boy waited for his mother to bid the inspectors goodbye and apologize for her youngest, who was a constant disappointment to her. And then the storm broke. Dame Elizabeth sent James and John out of the room, while she fetched the birch cane resting idly in the corner of the study and approached William. The boy flinched at the first cut, which ripped viciously across his forearms, and the next which tore across the back of his legs. The cane became a blur of pain, and he lost count of the strokes, but he would not cry out. Elizabeth was overcome with a rage that terrified her, and still she beat him. The stick crashed down on the cowering boy's head and back, and still she beat him. It was as if someone else held the cane, and she became a helpless onlooker. The boy crumpled to the ground, and still she beat him. Elizabeth only stopped when her other sons burst into the room and restrained her hand. Horrified at what their mother had done, James and John removed William from her presence and carried his unconscious form to the place at the top of the stairs where they locked him in. Elizabeth was summoned to court the next day and sent her eldest sons to their aunt some miles away, leaving William to fend for himself. She had no reason to believe that she would be kept away for 3 days, but on her return, accompanied by James and John, she hurried up the stairs to where William would be waiting, and found the lifeless body of her youngest boy curled up on the cold floor. At least there would be no further lessons. Dame Elizabeth, however, was stricken with guilt and remorse for over 40 years until her death, but there was to be no absolution. Her troubled spirit can still be seen wandering the east wing of Bisham Abbey, her skin the colour of ink, and her dress cream like parchment. Her hands are endlessly wet with blood and soap as she tries to wash away her sins in a ghostly basin that floats before her. For even her ghost can never escape the memory of her deeds, which still exist in the form of leather-bound exercise books, forever stained with the ink blots and tears of her son.
I was cleaning the windows and the door, and in the reflection of the mirror I saw somebody standing behind me, wearing a white smock or a coat like it's something similar to a gannymack, and I turned.
If you want some advice to get ahead, there's more to the laboratory than meets the eye. Are you sure you want to leave the house now?